kind of some of the stuff that I work on. Then I'd love if anybody afterwards, if anybody wanted to, if anyone has any like burning questions that they want to make sure we cover. Otherwise, we're going to kind of cover some smart contract basics and some fun ideas for what you can do with on-chain art once you kind of dive into like messing around with the guts of contracts. So I'm Isaac. I've taught a few of these classes now, I guess, with the art residency. I'm a smart contract developer for a long time. In my day job, I guess I focus on like Web3 security, but what's becoming taking up more and more of my time, thankfully, is various fun art projects from folks that I'm meeting at residencies. So I'll show a few examples of some cool projects that I've had the opportunity to help out on today, but then also just kind of dive into smart contracts. Curious if any what the kind of level of experience is with folks with messing around with smart contracts. Are you generally creating art using standard standard NFT templates, or are there specific like frameworks and stuff that people are messing around with that they kind of want to mention before we kick off? Nice. Cool. I will start by nice, yeah, manifold and standard NFT contracts and cool. Excellent. So my goal today is to tell you about the wide world of cool stuff that you can do once you start. I mean, there's great stuff that you can do on like standard marketplaces, especially with interesting new media formats that they're starting to support. But there's also some really fun stuff you can do as far as making. We'll talk a bit about autonomous art and like art that can own itself and art that can own other art, and all sorts of like really fun stuff that you can do once we start messing around with smart contracts. So I'm going to share in my entire screen just so that I have a couple tabs open that we might want to dive into. So we're talking today about smart contracts. We'll cover some basics on how they work and how various blockchains handle them. I have some cool links and some great like example projects from colleagues and other artists I've worked with. Then if people are interested, we can do some like live coding experiments where we pull up a standard NFT contract and we start messing around with it and see what we can make it do. The smart contracts are the core of how we can make blockchains programmable. Historically, with like the original chains like Bitcoin, they served almost pretty much exclusively to manage like the emission of new tokens and manage people's balances of specifically just Bitcoin. And there's like network fees which relate to network congestion, but you can basically think of it like a standard like a payments provider. This has changed a bit, I guess, in the last 6 months. When people have started deploying more art on Bitcoin. It's very, I don't say hacky in a bad way. I say hacky in like it's fun to see how people are trying to convince the Bitcoin blockchain to do things like storing art. Like I remember, I'll just find, I was at a conference in February. Let's see, Bitcoin NFT whole block. Let's see. So some person that was giving a talk at a conference where normally a Bitcoin, so smart chain, I'm just diving into stuff fast just because I'm just gonna go with what's kind of fun. But smart contract blocks basically typically on Bitcoin record just like updates to who has how much money. Like this person sent this money to this person, this money sent money to this person on Ethereum and Tezos and like other and Solana and all these other chains that have smart contracts. You can store any arbitrary data, but some people wanted to figure out like, can we convince Bitcoin to store an image? And so they spent way too much money and they had to like basically coerce a bunch of miners into, instead of storing useful data on chain as far as like transactions, they stored this JPEG, which took up an entire block. And I think it cost them like $100,000 to do. But it was like one of the first examples of somebody saying like, hey, we're going to store any arbitrary data that we want on this blockchain. And it was just a really fun experiment to see what would happen. After that, people started messing around more with something called ordinals, which I don't still fully understand how they work, but I guess they're a way of like encoding data into the blockchain as well. There was also like the counterparty movement historically, where people ran like a layer on top of Bitcoin that allowed you to create like, this is where like the rare Pepes and stuff came from. But like it was all super hacky because Bitcoin was never meant to store arbitrary data. It was just meant to store like fees and everything. But with Ethereum and Tezos and Near and all these like general purpose blockchains, we can create new tokens, we can define new applications, we can define business logic, whether you're trying to create like escrow contracts, or we can define like art collections and tie them to either on-chain data or reference off-chain data. And in these blockchains, the fees are not just based on the congestion of the network, but also like how complex is the thing that you're doing. Like that example on the Bitcoin blockchain, it cost them like $100,000 because they had to bribe a bunch of miners to rather than store a bunch of like normal transactions, they wanted to store an image. Similarly on Ethereum, if you're trying to store massive amounts of data, it's going to cost quite a lot. So we can use it for anything. We can manage Web3 native assets, like we can do fractionalization things, manage like governance over assets. We can define rules through which tokens can be used to vote on things and spend money, or change data, do anything that we want. Typically, smart contracts are, people like to use them for anything where normally there's a centralized middleman who's like brokering and rent seeking and taking a cut of like a market and figuring out how to disintermediate them and create peer-to-peer systems. And so they're good at stuff like that. Historically, they're not so good at knowing things about the outside world. So there's this whole network of basically oracles that are responsible for reporting data on chain. This is just because like the blockchain, you can think of it like a computer that's not even connected to. It's like an intranet. It's a computer that only knows what's on its own system, and it has no way of like calling out to a website and saying like, hey, what does Wikipedia say about this? So they're really not so great at knowing things about the outside world, unless you can come up with some really clever ways to make sure that only like real true data is getting on chain. They're not great at storing large amounts of data because by nature they're like replicated on everybody's computer around the world who's running it. So when you upload your art on chain, you're not just like uploading it to one computer, you're uploading it to like millions of computers, and that's why it costs fees. Because storage space is a premium. It's also not great at keeping things private, because even if you were to figure out some way of like encrypting data and like trying to do something where only certain people should be allowed to see things, all data is by nature on most blockchains completely public and transparent. And there's this kind of assumption in the cybersecurity space that all encryption will eventually be broken. So if you really want to keep something private forever and ever and for thousands of years, putting it on a public blockchain is not a great idea. So NFTs are a very good use case of smart contracts, especially when they relate to purely digital assets. There's some clever stuff that people are doing, tying things into the physical world. But when we're just talking about purely digital assets, NFTs are great for this. Decentralized control, so making it so that you can really define what it means to own something. You can even challenge what it means to own something. You can challenge the current market assumptions around like when I own something, it means I own your work. You can do all sorts of fun stuff with like what ownership actually means with smart contracts. And NFTs are also great for making it possible to have things like marketplaces, because they all have a standard interface that all speaks the same language. And that's why when you deploy something, you don't have to like go to OpenSea or somewhere and like list it. It's just automatically reading all data on chain, and everything that like fits a standard automatically gets surfaced. Smart contracts, specifically NFTs, that's kind of originally why they started really working, is because it defined a standard way for people to say, hey, this is how we're going to represent art, and that allowed people to create all sorts of like marketplaces and galleries just based on those standard interfaces. So through the standards, we can figure out who owns a token. We can figure out what data we should render when we're like representing a token. But the fun and okay, I'll get to the fun like customizable stuff in a second. But like standards are always evolving. Before we had the ERC 721 standards, we had just like regular tokens which were meant to encode balances. And when people like the Dada community and when the CryptoPunks community said like, well, what if we could represent images on chain? And so they're not actually like old tokens, and they're not standard NFTs. They're like this weird hybrid that emerged when whenever artists code, it really like pushes the boundaries as far as like what the standards are and what the use cases and what use cases we need to adapt to. So it's really through the pressure of artists figuring out how you can push the boundaries of these new media that we start to see standards which then apply throughout the space. Like we need that pressure from artists saying like, well, what if the art could do X? And then through artist and engineer collaborations, we figure out, okay, well, we can figure out a way to do that, and that's how like true innovation seems to happen in this space. Like we wouldn't have gotten to ERC 721 if like the Dada community or the CryptoPunks community were not saying like, well, why can't we represent like images on chain, and why can't we trade art and collect art on chain? So the standards are important, but they're actually not super limiting. All that you really need to do to be a compliant NFT is say like what your name is, what your symbol is, like what the URI of the art is, which basically says how should you display me on an interface, and who owns it. But again, like we can play around with that. And then it needs to have a function for transferring. It doesn't have to work. Like I've seen actually a lot of like really fun projects where art is completely not transferable. So if you just like have these 6 functions in a smart contract, it technically is an NFT. Like you can put in any other rules that you want, but as long as it conforms to these basic standards, it will be recognized by any marketplace. Like it will be recognized in any gallery, but then you can mess around with it all you want. So there's no rules really. There's like, if you want, there's no rules that say that your art has to be static forever, or that it has to be permanently available. That's like kind of a norm that people have developed around it, where it's like we expect NFTs to be like ownable and permanent and immutable, but like you don't have to follow those rules. You can have it so that it changes the content based on the day of the week. You can have it change the content based on who owns it. You can have it, let's say that you have an audio NFT and you want like the audio to degrade every time it's transferred, like how audio degrades when it goes from cassette to cassette. You can do that. You can make it so that you always like kind of like leave an imprint on a wallet, like every time if your art is ever in somebody's wallet and they transfer it out, you can make it so that it like leaves some sort of like weird negative in there that stays forever. NFTs can own other NFTs. Multiple people can own the same token, and they can govern it in fun ways, or you can make or you can like change how ownership is managed. And to make these changes, you do it like in the actual code of the smart contract. And so when you're using something like a manifold or something, it's really good for like, here's a standard NFT contract, here's my art, here's how many there are. But if you also like kind of go to their GitHub and look at their smart contracts, you can mess around with them, deploy them yourselves, and do all sorts of fun stuff. Some examples of fun stuff are like NFTs that are linked to other NFTs. And so here's a project that I worked on with Operator recently, where this was like a human motion data driven generative art project, where there was an underlying, rather than just like token hash randomness driving the output of an image, we had the token hash create a unique choreography score, which the choreography score then told the image how to compose itself. And with this, we now, I think what's going to be coming out next with this project is a way for people to see what the underlying choreography is of their NFT. So on the right, we have like a standard NFT, which has like ownership, its transferability, and a fixed supply and everything. But soon people will be able to get a second NFT, which is permanently tied to the first one. Like you cannot transfer like transfer this second NFT out of your wallet. It just always is there if the other NFT is in the wallet. And that's showing kind of like a behind the scenes, here's the actual choreography that drove the image. So in this way you can create NFTs that are linked to other NFTs permanently, like and that can never be like sold separately or delinked. You can make autonomous art. So here's a couple projects which I'm working a bit on with the artists. And so on the right we have Plantoid. So this is a real physical sculpture which is tied to a smart contract where the sculpture itself has a smart contract which allows it to reproduce. And in this case, what reproduction means is every time somebody sends money, like ETH, to this contract, they receive an NFT in return, and that those funds get collected in a smart contract until the time when the sculptor decides to reproduce. At which point it can give the endowment of funds that it's collected to another artist to make another sculpture. And so it's like this like system of collecting funds and not like buying an NFT from an artist, but you're basically funding an endowment to produce the next work in a series. So that's like Plantoid is a really cool example of autonomous art. Little Martians is another really cool example of autonomous art, where these ceramic sculptures that an artist named Vanessa, she creates these, and then they are like NFTs that own themselves. So they're a physical thing with a chip on them, and the chip ties each sculpture to an NFT on chain. And you don't ever actually own the NFT. You can own the sculpture, but the sculpture owns itself. And I know that's kind of like a wacky concept, but like these are kind of like the fun stuff that you can do once you kind of like break out of the traditional marketplace contracts. You can make NFTs that like burn themselves. And so here was an artist that I met at an art residency in the fall, Gordon, where these were NFTs that were tied to the seasons, and like after a certain amount of time, they just were straight up destroyed. Like so that it was a temporary thing. It's like you can buy this, but you can only own this for the next month until it's destroyed. You can have NFTs that like mint, or that NFTs that vote. So you can have it so that when people buy things, they're actually governing a collective amount of funds, which perhaps can be used for future works, that can be used for any sort of like a purpose that you have in mind. Or you can have NFTs that contain other NFTs. And so like here's this like music NFT project that I worked on last year, where people actually purchased a pack of, and then when they opened the pack, they received like 4 songs, kind of like, opening a pack of Pokemon cards. So these are some of like the fun ideas that I've seen played around with like custom NFT smart contracts. So I kind of wanted to pause there for a moment and just get some people's feedback. Like what are some of the cool ideas that you have in mind for things that you would love for your art to do? What do you want to perhaps challenge and break? I'd love to hear some feedback from folks in the cohort.
Hey, I'm Carolina. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
That will inspire. Will, depending on the answer, will tell you. I'll then tell you what I'd like to do with my artwork.
Mm-hmm.
So for the operator drop, I know that Art Blocks requires everything to be on chain, but it looked like that that other image is
Mm-hmm.
just a JPEG of some kind, or a PNG or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I was also wondering about, the fact that it is the operator piece has so much figurative quality, and I was just wondering how you made that work.
Sure. So yeah, the concept of on chain is kind of funny with Art Blocks, because yes, the script to generate the images stored on chain. And there was a ton of like actual like data and like all of the physics that went into creating that. The script size actually got quite large, so I think that I had to do like 13 different transactions to upload it, and cost like quite a lot of ETH. I was basically like sitting on my computer at like 1 in the morning waiting for gas prices to go down, and so like so this is a like P5.js script, which is like uploaded on chain, but it's not executable on chain. Like that's kind of like a fun, an interesting distinction around like you can like record a generative art algorithm on chain, but it's just the code on chain, and then your browser is actually the thing that's rendering it. On the left, this is actually going to be a dynamic SVG. All of the little like SVG components are also going to be on chain, and then when it reveals your specific piece, it like actually on chain in the Solidity code builds the SVG object. Builds the SVG object and then like outputs this image, which can also be rendered in your browser. So like the concept of like when art is on chain, there's quite a few options for what you can do, if that makes sense. Also tell me if it doesn't make sense and I just went off on a tangent.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. It sounds like it's a little different than other projects that have been on our blocks. It's not purely algorithmic.
So it is algorithmic, and it uses the same base randomness. It just instead of going straight from like traits, going straight from like randomness to like colors and images and organization, it goes from token randomness to a like choreo score, which then drives the image. But it's still the same. It still follows the same rules as far as like token hash comes in and then an algorithm runs, and then it produces the image at the end. It's just like ultra convoluted.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Cool. And then let's see, touch design assets. So like can you like expand on what your question is around like the touch design assets?
Sure. Hi, first of all, and my question is about I'm very new to touch design and I'm just learning like how it works. Obviously not for like in real life events only. I was wondering like how to even upload a touch design asset that people can interact with on blockchain because I've never done that, but I'm pretty sure it's something simple because I saw that a lot. But my question is like, does it need to be written on a contract or I just need to upload like the piece that I make on one of the softwares and then it works?
I'm not entirely sure like the format that Touch Designer outputs in. Like when I've used Touch Designer tools, I get like a TOE file or something, which then I have to like run in Touch Designer. But I think that you can probably also like create like scenes, which are exported as if that's the case, then like things can either be like MP4 like movie files, or they can be like standard data formats that can be rendered on like AR VR systems, and then so like that's what you could either upload all of that on chain, or you can like reference, or you can like have that if it's too huge. You can upload it on a system like IPFS or Arweave, and then have a reference to that on chain. Either way, people when they look at the piece, they'll be getting the data and they'll be like looking at the art. It's just like it's kind of a just a stylistic choice in my opinion of like whether you upload like absolutely every file on chain, or you just kind of upload the references that you need to recreate the thing on chain. I'm not as much of a purist, I think, as some around like because like to me, at the end of the day, you're not uploading the Chrome browser on chain, and like people have to look at it in the Chrome browser. So yeah, that's just like you can upload some stuff on chain and some stuff off, but then like it just ends up being rendered in the browser throughout like using a standard viewer.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Hello, Isaac.
Hello.
I would like to know, are there any project that interesting projects that interact with Tezos blockchain, like you said about Ethereum blockchain.
I have not deployed as much on Tezos, but actually on let's see, I'll share a whole screen. There was a actually don't even know where to find it at the moment, but like if you look at my actually my profile picture on Twitter is actually something I got from a Tezos artist at NFT Paris, where they had this cool they had this artist that would like had robots drawing portraits of people, and then like uploading the portraits on chain, and then also giving you the portraits that were drawn by the robots by hand, like during the session. And like that's probably my favorite Tezos NFT, was like this really cool thing where you had to like go physically to the thing, get a portrait taken, and then you like later got this NFT on chain of your own self portrait, and also like these like physical objects. I wish I need to like remember who what the actual artist's name was, because that was like one of the coolest things that I've seen on Tezos. And I see a question from Emily. Yeah, happy to talk about like the operator experience. In fact, earlier today I was just like pulling up like the massive like Miro board that was like the journey of this project, which like is absolute chaos. But like basically throughout the project, I didn't really even like know what the final outputs were going to look like. Like operator, like DJ and Anya had in their head like how everything was going to fit together, and like figuring out creating all the tools, touch designer tools, and like glass physics rendering to compose the objects, and then like all of these pieces were all of these like components were like going on in parallel as we were figuring out how to like actually compose something. But we created like actually quite a few like tools. We actually created quite a few tools that helped us along the way to like tune the generative art algorithm. I can actually run those live and show you guys what that looks like. So let's see. Right. Glitch. Bear with me a second. Trust me, this is fun. Model. Start that, and so I'll pull up. So this is like the development environment that we were using for the project. Let's see. So this is this like yes, Patrick Trista. That sounds familiar. I think that was the artist. But that was like yes, that's correct. Thank you. Yeah, I went to this like exhibition at NFT Paris like last January and got my robot portrait done. I love it. So when you're working on a generative art project with art blocks, like the process of like generative art model tuning is quite chaotic. Like if I pull up this is like this environment where every time I refresh we get a new image, and like this was the development environment we were using to figure out like how to like tune the algorithm to produce stuff that we always liked. But early on, it like was not producing like it was not nearly like maybe even like 1% of the time it was producing like stuff that we actually liked. If I go into this folder, which was like some of our like earliest versions of the project, like you'll see that like these look very different. Like this this is not anything close to the finished piece, but you can see like some of the elements are there. We're like, okay, we're starting to figure out how to like make glass and body parts and stuff overlay, but like we're really like not happy with the color palette. We don't understand like why it's like looking the way it is. And then over time, like you start, you kind of have to have this mindset when you're tuning a generative art algorithm that you like always are moving forward. Like here's like one of my favorite testnet outputs that came from like March. But like this was one image that we loved out of like tens of thousands of images that we hated. And so, or that they hated. I was actually fine with a lot of them. Like this one was cool, but like how do we? It's really hard to kind of when you're doing like a generative art algorithm, to like always kind of move forward and like get better and better and better. So like we would go through this process of generating like massive batches of images, like thousands at a time. And like this was a folder of like these were like way too washed out. But we didn't know why the algorithm was producing like washed out images. And yes, we're drawing the body parts in P5. So we took the initial sketches, and then in P5 it's using like the P5 Bezier curves to draw the body parts on the canvas. So the generative art tuning process, we ended up coming up with I use this like data science tool that I've used before called Jupyter Notebooks, where we can like basically make thousands and thousands of images and then bucket them into like generative art like parameter ranges that we liked and parameter ranges that we didn't, so that we could figure out like why certain ones were like muddy and dark and why certain ones were like light and washed out, and eventually get to the point where like everything looked great. And so this is this like big like data science tool that's telling us like, okay, when it's colorful, these are the parameter ranges, and when it's not colorful, these are the parameter ranges. And like this is a tool that we use to just figure out like how do we like navigate this like really complex algorithm to narrow in on like the ranges of images that we did like. And so this is a tool that I'm planning on like open sourcing at some point soon, which I would love to, if anyone in the residency is interested in building like a generative art model, and like needs help doing like the tuning process, planning on just like writing some content and releasing these tools, so that we can so that people can help, so that we can help with that. Because if you're just like digging through an algorithm and like changing like one line at a time, you might like, oh crap, I changed that thing and now I'm not getting any of the images I like anymore. But now this thing is fixed. So like we kind of had to take this data science approach to tuning, in order to get to the point where like the images were producing like consistent results. And in fact, oh yeah, here's a preview of, I'm working on the secondary NFT now, where this is like my trying to get SVGs to automatically render. But we also use Jupyter Notebooks for creating the P5 for creating like the P5 scripts to draw the body parts. So yeah, happy to dive in on that stuff if anyone wants. We could even do a specific like how to not go crazy while tuning a generative art algorithm. That would be a really fun thing to talk through with people, because it kind of makes you go crazy, especially towards the end, when it's like, yeah, chaos. So NFTs that have multiple owners. So you can, in the simple case, like you can have an NFT that's owned by a like DAO or owned by a multisig, but you can also say like this NFT, like you can like override the owner field so that it like changes the owner on the day of the week. So like you can put in the same token ID. You can say like on Monday this NFT is owned by this person, on Tuesday it's owned by this person. So you can like mess with that just by changing like the owner function. And like that's some cool stuff that you can do. And let's see, from Ether, working a poet with hermeneutics and interpretation of text, in which the text would evolve over time. Yes, you can definitely have like text that evolves over time. You can do that in a number of ways, where you could like have it so that you're manually going in and like updating the text over time of the work, or you could have it, you could have some sort of algorithm that's like, here's the set of text that could possibly exist, and like here's the conditions that would make the poem change on a certain day according to certain rules. That's like very, very doable. Yes, and yeah, we should do a specific, like, yeah, let's do it. We'll call it, we called it like the final 5%, or that's what like the operator was calling it, where it's like the project is 95% good, but it's not an art project until you like start pulling your hair out for weeks making it, really figuring out all the last little bits. So that final 5% was like 80% of the time going crazy. So if you feel that way, that's I guess that's normal. And nice. Any other questions? I can also pull up, I have like a coding environment where we can just like look at the guts of an NFT contract. Nice, I will start that, but feel free to interrupt me still. So with operator, there was let's see, there was quite a lot of folks, and actually a cool thing about the operator project is that if you right click and inspect, it has like the full credits of everyone that helped out. So that's Alex. He's the shader developer. So he was the one that figured out how to make glass in P5. I was responsible for kind of tying all the pieces together and making the generative art algorithm. Dija and Anya, of course, on all of like the art direction and the choreography. And then we actually had help from a lot of folks in the P5 community, the touch designer community, creating like custom tools for us to do the process. And then also, of course, all of the dancers performing along the way. Cool. So this is Remix. This is a really like handy like browser thing where you don't have to install any like complex like software programming stuff on your computer just to get started. This is an NFT smart contract. I'm going to zoom in. So in this case, this is like 1,000 lines. Like it doesn't need to be nearly this long, but this is just like a standard NFT smart contract. The important stuff is down here at the bottom, where I have a contract called my NFT. And in my NFT, we can define the name of it, we can define the symbol, and we can define the URI. The URI is how it tells it like what image to render. The URI tells it what image to render, what video to render, what media to render when it's viewed. And then we have the mint function. So in this case, if we were to like deploy this smart contract on chain, it's completely unprotected. It doesn't cost anything. Like anyone can come and just like basically press mint. And then like a new token is done. So every time I'm pressing this, like it's minting a new token. This is cool when you just want to like test things, or like maybe you have an idea where like I don't care, everyone can come and like get a token with no rules. If you want to add additional logic, like hey, people can only get like one token at a time. That's where you can add a line where it's like, okay, require that the balance of message.sender is less than 1. Let's see, less than 1. And just with that simple line, we've now completely changed like the contract such that like people can only come and get like one at a time. You can also make it so that they need like your permission to mint or something like that. So we can also mess with, when we talk about messing with ownership, the owner of function is a standard function in the NFT contract, but you can do something called overriding it, where I can say like function owner of token ID and just say override, and instead override, let's see, returns address. And so instead of like the typical owner of saying like who owns this NFT, I could make it so that return owner of like token ID -1. So like this simple line maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but like basically I'm saying that instead of you owning your NFT, you actually own the person before you's NFT. And so like it's just like a weird it's intended to be a provocation of like, okay, what if you actually owned what if you actually owned your neighbor's NFT, or like you needed for some reason, like you needed their permission to transfer a token. So like you can just kind of go in and say, nope, I don't want owner of to behave like it does for everyone else's tokens. I want it to behave. I want it to behave in like a fun, weird way. You can have like an update. You can have it have like an update content function where it's like update content, and you can restrict this to like only owner. In this case, the owner is like, say, the artist of the contract. And then now you have a function where like you can go in and change the NFT at any time for people. Like to me, like that's actually kind of cool if maybe like the artist comes in and changes something. You can yeah, so all sorts of like weird stuff that you can do just by like messing around with like with Solidity. The best way to get started with this is this let's see, where is it? Speed Run Ethereum. So even if you're not a coder, even if you have like some coding experience, this is my absolute favorite like tutorial on smart contracts, and especially like getting up to speed with NFTs. It's a completely like free quest thing that a friend of mine created, and you just kind of come in and say, okay, I'm going to learn the basics of how to make a simple NFT, and also like mess around with it. So like you go to this quest, and like here's all the instructions you will need. Not saying that there won't be hiccups whenever you're doing something in programming. Inevitably, your computer is going to say something like, you have the wrong version of X installed, or I don't recognize this command. It's just painful as you're starting to get started with like messing around with code. But I encourage you to persevere, Google every error message you get, ping people in Telegram, because what you'll end up with is like, you'll then know the entire stack of like, if I want to start from scratch, I don't want to use anybody else's frameworks. You'll have the entire stack in your mind of like how to create your own NFT with your own custom logic. And so this is like highly recommend following along with this tutorial and see how far you can get. And I'm sure that it will spark some ideas as you're going along. Nice. Any other fun ideas?
That's
or
really
questions?
cool. Yeah, it's really cool. I would like to know, for example, if I want to create artwork like on art blocks or FXhash when mintable token, like is it the same logic behind this, or is it some kind of other contract or some additional deeper knowledge is required for this thing?
Yeah, it tends to be pretty framework specific. Like they'll have their own rules. So like in Artblock's case, it's like you can have like one dependency for your like rendering script and stuff. So but you have a lot of freedom in like how your image gets in like how your actual like algorithm works. But then at the end of the day, you're uploading your algorithm to their smart contract. And so like it's completely locked into the rules of their auctions, so you don't tend to not have any customizability on the logic when you're working with like a standard like community like that. So I think some have a bit more freedom in that, and I know that there's some folks working on some things using like the Artblocks engine, where like it'll give you a bit more freedom to mess around with like the contract rules and stuff like that. But typically, if you're doing something with folks like that, you're pretty limited in like how much you can mess around with the guts of the smart contract. and you're instead like encouraged to then focus just on like, okay, how to make the weirdest, coolest algorithm to generate the images. But yeah, so you don't always with those you don't always have the freedom to mess with the contracts. But when you're doing like your own solo projects or perhaps with some different platforms, you can like do more custom code.
Oh, thanks. But so can I do the same on my own website, creating my own smart contract, but to have like one artwork that will have different generative tokens, like
Yes.
yes.
Yeah, you can have it all on your own website. You don't. This is all stuff that you can host yourself with like that speedrun Ethereum. There's a lot of templates also in there for like setting up your own like minting website and everything. So yeah, so that you have to kind of come up to speed with not just smart contracts, but then also like front end website development. But it's all available and all relatively off the shelf and customizable.
Thank you. And also, I have one more question. Sorry.
No?
I was thinking about, is it possible to create, for example, generative piece that would actually be connected to the state of blockchain, like that would indicate some kind of when, for example, blockchain is slower than usual, or the price is going higher, or and it would show some kind of color change or maybe some, I don't know, visual difference. Yeah, that I think.
Yeah. So here's a fun example of like, again, just like, you know, this is just developers messing around, so this is not necessarily like the highest art and stuff. But the purpose of this NFT was to show that you can read dynamic data from on-chain and then put it inside of the dynamic art. And so the place that you do that inside of the smart contract is inside of the token URI function. So the token URI function normally just like in a lot of NFTs, it returns like a static string where it's like, okay, here's the link to the PNG of the artwork. But you can also add logic there. And in this case, what the token URI function is doing is it's like reading what is the current gas fees of the network, what is the current like hash of the like the last token that was created. And so you can, this is actually, it reads in data from the smart contract and uses that to feed the image. So it doesn't have to fetch it from an external API. This data is like available within Solidity's execution environment, and so it's just saying like, okay, what is the block number? What is like the and so you can include those function calls inside of, just remember the token URI function. That's where you can add in all that logic to make it dynamic based on the state of the blockchain.
Oh, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
A lot to think about. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll send the URL to Bernie Boys. And another nice thing about the Bernie Boy thing, fully open source. And if you want to like take it, the best way to learn this stuff is just like take something that exists, like a open source code, try to just like run it locally on your computer, and then just start messing around with like, okay, what if I change this line? Often you'll be like, oh crap, that whole thing broke, and then you learn why did that break. And like that's the fastest way to learn, is just to like take something that already works and then just start messing around with it until it breaks and understand why it's breaking. And then over time you can add your own customizability. But I mean, that's how I learn. I'm a software developer for a long time. That's how I learn every time I have to learn a new concept. I find someone else that's already done something close to what I did, and then I try to what I want to do, and then I just mess with it until I like figure out how to bash it into what I wanted to do. Nobody writes code from scratch, like nobody.
It's Carolina again. I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
So can you use ChatGPT to help you write your smart contracts?
Yes. Actually, that might be a fun demo. I don't know if anyone here's tried that, but let's ask. Let's see. Right. You are a top-tier smart contract developer and a creative genius. You are going to be my friend and collaborate on a new art project. I'll write the spec, and you can respond with Solidity code. Ready? Cool. Ready. So let's create a smart contract with dynamic token data, which changes based on whether the current block number is divisible by 100. Come on. So yeah, you don't even need people like me anymore. We can just actually, I think it does help to flatter ChatGPT. It makes the experience just much more fun. And then you can tell it it's doing a good job. Like, okay, so let's see. We have dynamic art. Let's see. It gave us a constant called divisible and not divisible. Mint token, set token name. Okay, so what it's doing here is just like making it so that when the token is minted, it would like change. It would change it. But what I really want is like let's see. Thanks, but that's not quite right. I would like the token URI to be dynamic rather than being set on mint. Would you mind trying again? Cool. Yeah, a friend of mine, when I watched her interact with ChatGPT, it kind of changed how I do it, because it's like, initially it was like, you talk to Siri or something, and you're like talking very robotically, where it's like, add this to my shopping cart. But instead, like, you really can just, you can really just like have a chat with these these things. Okay, cool. So now it has a URI for the divisible version and a URI for the not divisible version, and it's thinking. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. Nice. Okay, it did it. So here, this is exactly right. So you can look at token URI, and you can see how it says if the block number is divisible by 100, return this URI. Otherwise, return this URI. And so I can like just copy this and paste this in here. Yeah, this might actually be a fun place to start. I don't normally code this way, but like if you're just like saying like, hey, would this be possible? You can just like mess with ChatGPT. Yeah, good job. Great work. We are all very impressed. Nice. Yes, it looks so from my like visual compiling it. I don't see anything in here that would cause an error. Or maybe it doesn't, but it looks close. This looks like this would get you. This would get you pretty close. Like this is at least this would look pretty close to my first attempt as well. And then we can mess with it. Nice. Any other questions, comments, or crazy ideas, or we can wrap soon until the next time when we talk generative art tuning. Yes, Solidity compiles. Solidity compiles into bytecode, and then that's what actually gets uploaded on chain. Okay, sorry, I might be missing something too. Nice. Any other ideas for things to dive into?
Hello, it's me again. Sorry, I have a lot of questions because the operator piece kind of did inspire me a lot, and I was wondering about that kind of combo of things being either analog or just you mentioned it was SVG or a PNG. It wasn't a PNG, maybe, but I would imagine since there was handwriting on there that it was some kind of a image that was originally a PNG, which was made into an SVG. I would imagine. But I don't know about that. But in any case, I am making images in Midjourney, and then I've been using Adobe Illustrator to vectorize them. So if I wanted to do something similar, not with bodies and glass and so forth, but with other kinds of elements, could I do that process the same way that Operator did it, where I would have some kind of a model of what I wanted? And I was just wondering, how do you go about beginning that? What do you need to even make something like that happen?
Yeah. So I think that it's. I hesitate to say what you should do first because actually the constraints actually that help a bit. So in the beginning we knew that it was either going to be P5JS or 3JS, and we weren't sure which was the right one. And then based on the components that they wanted, which was like generative glass, and like body parts and the ability to like draw paths on the canvas. It seemed like the P5 library was right for that. But we ran into a lot of hiccups along the way. So like if you're talking about like vectorizing and exporting images, P5 doesn't handle SVGs super elegantly. That's why we had to like deconstruct the SVGs and turn them into like those Bezier curves and then draw them in P5. And so if you're like taking relatively complex SVGs, drawing them like in P5 might be a challenge. You can also do things like just write like HTML and JavaScript code to generate this kind of stuff. So it's like it's kind of like a fight between you want to give yourself some constraints as far as like I am going to use this library and this is like some outputs that I have in mind and these are some inputs that I have in mind. And then it's a lot of figuring out why the tools are not going to do the thing that you actually want them to do, and then figuring out kind of in that tension, figuring out how you can like produce something that you want to produce and how it's going to look while working within those constraints. Because if you just look at like I said at the beginning of the call, like artists are the ones who kind of push the technology to do stuff that it initially wasn't meant to do, but then it just becomes part of the stack. So you probably will, if you have like something in your mind of how you want this to work, you can find some technologies that are going to help you, but you probably are not going to find something perfect, and that's okay, because then you'll figure out a creative way around it and a way to like coerce it to do what you want. At least that was my experience over the last like 6 months or so of this, of like, okay, this thing does not, it literally says it doesn't support this, but like, no, we have to make it do this. Okay, let's figure out a way to try to make it do this. That's kind of like what the experience. Nice. Well, happy to wrap there for now, but also happy to talk about. I can chat with the VCA folks about some generative art specific thing. That would be really fun. And cool. Feel free to ping me if you have like wacky ideas. And I can like kind of gut check and like recommend certain tech certain like technologies to look at. But yeah, I guess just as like parting thoughts, trying to make technology and machines do art is always going to be challenging, but like it's highly worth it just because like it pushes the industry forward, it pushes like what you can do with the tech forward, and it produces really cool stuff for us all to experience. So excited to see what you guys come up with. Nice. Talk to you all soon.